It's called the Spiderman fallacy. The logic goes something like this. Spider-Man lives in New York City. New York City is a real place, but that doesn't mean that Peter Parker is a real guy with Spidey sense. So when Christians point out that the Gospel of John gets historical details right, locations, distances, Jewish customs, the skeptic just says, cool story, bro, but just because John mentions real places doesn't mean that Jesus actually rose from the dead.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. The fact is, he's just portraying this as if it's some coincidental or really poor argument with the cartoons and the laughing and the memes. But frankly, if you just divorce the images on the screen and listen to the point he's saying, just because something has real places or locations doesn't mean that the contents of the story are actually accurate or actually trustable or reliable. That's a perfectly fine, understandable argument. You look at it, when people make mundane claims about the past, you have no reason to object to them. But when people make claims that are impressive or unlikely or perhaps supernatural in some cases, we have all the more reason to doubt those events because historically humans have lied. Humans have lied insofar as humans create their own mythology and cultures. Humans have done that throughout all of society. We have not just Christian mythology, we have Muslim mythology, we have Hindu mythology, we have Zoroastrianist mythology, we have Egyptian mythology, we have Greek mythology, we have Roman mythology. And in all of those myths, there are real places used. There are real customs and cultures referenced. However, you can look at many different pieces of history and acknowledge what's referencing maybe a cultural practice of the time and what is a mythological invention. That's the distinction and nuance that I think requires maybe a more scholarly eye, or frankly, just a common sense kind of eye when looking into religion.
Now, this is all very hilarious, but it hilariously misses the point. First of all, highly researched, realistic, historical fiction, as we know it today, didn't really exist yet. Ancient writers...
This is irrelevant. It doesn't matter that there wasn't fiction as we know it today in the past. The fact is that people in the past have always written fiction. Maybe it's not specifically the genre as we know it today from after the Enlightenment or what have you, but people have always written fantastical stories. People have always written mythological stories. So this argument that because the genre of fiction didn't exist at this time, therefore it's improbable for people to have written mixing historical truths or cultural practices with mythological, ideas is impossible, is absurd. Of course you can do it. You can write a real place and then make some stuff up on top of that. There's nothing stopping you from that. Just because a particular genre of writing didn't exist at that time doesn't mean that you couldn't have done it.
Could produce romances, legends, and propaganda, but not modern-style historical novels filled with casual local detail for real.
It's not relevant.
Realism's sake. And when you compare John with many later apocryphal gospels, the contrast is super clear. They severely lack John's
apocryphal gospels like Thomas or Mary, for example, but I'm not sure what the relevance here is either. You can look at several different mythological texts of the past and compare them and say what is and what isn't referenced more or less in the others. That if you want to bring out a specific example and talk about that, then that's something you can do. But just saying that there's an apocryphal gospel that's not close to realism versus a canonical gospel that is, that doesn't bring any more, cheddar to your argument that John is more historical. It just means that there are a lot of mythological accounts written around this Jesus character in the 1st and 2nd century. And frankly, the fact that there even exists some things as apocryphal gospels, or there exists canonical scripture that was chosen after councils over time, I think lends to the idea that this isn't an accurate historical telling. It's a religion that was invented and developed over time. And you can tell that with the contents of John. If you want to compare John to other gospels, you don't even need to compare it to apocryphal gospels to see all of the differences, the timings of when Jesus was crucified and buried, or versus was it on the night of one day or was it on the evening of another day? What about the specific things Jesus says? Does he say, let it, what does he say on the cross? What is the historical context there? Does it contradict the other gospels literally in the same Bible? It does. The character of Jesus does too, and it actually is indicative quite of the theological development and invention of the Jesus character over time. Jesus is much more, parable speaking and under the radar, so to speak, in the other Gospels, whereas in John, there are much more I am so-and-so, the way, the truth, and the life, what have you, all of these more grandiose claims to divinity. So it's clear from a historical perspective that John is not an example of history. It's mythological invention, development of the Christian story.
Its dense texture of geography, custom, social assumptions, and incidental first-century detail. Secondly, if our argument was, hey, John mentions Jerusalem exists, therefore everything in the book is 100% really, true, that really would be a terrible argument. But nobody is saying that. Fiction often uses real settings, but here's where the skeptic's logic completely breaks down, and it exposes a massive double standard.
Let's hear it.
Notice what happens the second a skeptic thinks that John gets a historical detail wrong. Take John 9:22. John mentions that people were terrified of being thrown out of the synagogue for calling Jesus the Messiah. They instantly pounce on this. They say, that's an anachronism. That didn't happen until decades later. John screwed up. Now I'll answer this in another video, but set aside whether their objection is even true for a second. Look at the rule they just invented. If John gets a detail wrong, it counts as massive evidence against him. But if John gets incredibly difficult, obscure historical details right, the skeptic says, that doesn't matter because Spiderman. But
no, I feel like this is like one-dimensional understanding of what the argument implies and what it means to have historical evidence or not in your piece of writing means is being grossly misinterpreted. If you have something that is accurate historically in a piece of writing, what that means is that piece of writing has an accurate historical piece of information. Okay. Doesn't mean that the rest of the writing or the entirety of the writing is accurate per se. It just means that it happens to reference perhaps something culturally accurate of the time or something historically accurate of the time. Okay. If you have something that's historically inaccurate written in your text, i.e. an anachronism, imagine somebody writing about smartphones used by people in the 1980s. You would know that's an anachronism. That does show that that text is containing something incorrect, an anachronism. It's literally called, yes. If it contains something historically wrong, then it's wrong. I suppose it's possible that it has a historical inaccuracy, yet other parts of it could be true, but doesn't it not lead you more likely to the conclusion that this is a historical invention, that this is a piece of fiction being written and developed over time? Who knows? But the point is that it's not a double-edged sword. It's not an example of skeptics being hypocritical. It's just the evidentiary, it leads you to that path. If it has a historical anecdote that's true, okay, it has a historical anecdote that's true. It's not saying that it's true and therefore it's wrong. It's just saying it's true, okay, it has a part that's true. Whether or not that means the rest of it is true is a different story. If it has a historical inaccuracy, then that is damning to the piece of argument there. It's interesting that he even brings that up. Using an anachronism in John to say that John is somehow more accurate is like what the ultimate thing he's trying to say. He's basically trying to throw under the rug that, oh yeah, there's this anachronism people say is an anachronism, but don't worry about that, I'll answer that in another video. But saying the anachronism there is then a bad thing? Wow, that's so hypocritical of the skeptics. No, that's just like basic logic and understanding. We'll say it again, clear it up. If you have something historically inaccurate, then yes, it's historically inaccurate. It indicates that your writing is likely made up or fictional, or has, at the very minimum, a fictional element in it, or a poorly misunderstood or a incorrectly written part to it, an anachronism. Nobody had smartphones in the 1980s, right? If your piece of writing has a historical accuracy in it, it references a place, it references a culture that did exist at that time, okay, it has that. That does not indicate that the rest of the writing is all true or accurate. And a Christian would do the same thing. You could imagine something in the Quran or the Book of Mormon, whatever, that contains a historical anachronism. You could rightly point that out and rightly say that this indicates that this piece of writing is more likely than not true, or at least at the very minimum has parts to it that are not true. you could say then, if that Quran or Book of Mormon writing has parts of it that are true, okay, it just references places and things that are true and did exist or do exist. Doesn't mean that the rest of it is true. You'll do this like the average Christian will deny and say Mormonism is false, is a lie. It's a scam, right? If it's said in New York, they can argue, well, yeah, I mean, if he finds it in New York, sure, New York's a real place, but that doesn't mean he actually found the golden place. And then you point the same Book of Mormon feed out that it references, horses in the Americas, where there should not have been horses. Horses were, emigrated way, way, way later than the Book of Mormon purports. They would say that is an anachronism. That indicates that the Book of Mormon is a lie. So there's no way that they don't use the same skeptic arguments when it has anything to do with anything else other than the protected Christian ideology that they have bubbled off in their brain. It is literally just special pleading for their own Christian myth in this particular Gospel of John that they say that anachronisms are not indications that this is a lie, and that historical accuracies are anything more than just, coincidentally accurate mundane points, and that they actually do bring truth to the other supernatural claims of the book. You can divorce, just like in Spiderman or the Book of Mormon, the real location references from the other fantastical claims in the book of writing. And anyone else will do this. You don't even have to look at like other religions that I'm talking about now. You can just imagine you're talking to your imaginative 5-year-old child and you ask them what they did today at school, right? Or at daycare or whatever. And they say, oh yeah, daycare, we played hopscotch, and I actually had this crazy hopscotch tournament with my friend Jimmy, and he hopscotched for a whole hour just on his one foot around the whole room. Oh wow, that's really cool, my young child Tommy. That's such a great story. Thanks for telling me. You know that your daycare exists, your child exists, your child's friends exist. You identify all of these as real elements of your child's story, but you know that his imaginative brain, his creative process, he didn't actually take a timer and measure his friend, bouncing around the hopscotch for a full hour. You know that the average 5-year-old is just going to peter out after a couple minutes, right? You know that a teacher would stop them because they have some other event or activity or there's snack time or something like that, or they would be worried about them getting hurt, right? You would have heard from the teacher or your child's friend's parents about this crazy thing your kid did, or they would be absent the next day because of the injury they likely sustained, right? You know that all of these are inaccurate elements, yet you can identify that there are accurate elements of your child's story. So even if your child is telling you about this 1 hour hopscotch adventure jamboree, and even if they add in more accurate elements that they had for snack today, we had apple juice and orange slices, and you checked your school's brochure for the month. They tell you what snacks they eat this month, and oh yes, it matches with today, a Wednesday, July 22nd. Oh yes, our school snack time today is in fact apple juice and orange slices. Oh wow, that matches up, and it matches up with your son's account that we actually today we did this fun song. We sang Old MacDonald Had a Farm, and you can call and verify the music teacher from the daycare, and he's like, oh yes, we did sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Oh wow, that matches up. Look at all these historical facts that my 5-year-old is telling me that are accurate. And you could even call and verify. Maybe your son tells you, actually, and I did, during a game of Foursquare, for example, I fell and I hurt my knee, and you can look at your kid's knee and see that there's a little bruise there, and my teacher put a Band-Aid on it, and you can see that there's a Band-Aid there as well. Dozens of historical and contextual and cultural elements that are accurate, and really just no one could make up unless they were there, unless they knew about it, unless they heard about it. That's all well and dandy, but you still recognize that the hour straight hopscotch is likely fictitious, regardless of the amount of other unrelated details. That's the regular logic that we all have as just, human adults, or even, human children or teenagers past a certain age. You recognize what is probable and what is not probable. And just because you have somebody telling you a story with 99 probable parts doesn't mean that they can throw in one unprobable part and suddenly you swallow that more easily, right? That just means that they have a story with one lie and 99 truths.
Evidence doesn't work that way. It cuts both ways. And the reality is, John gets an overwhelmingly amount of difficult facts right, as we've discussed already in this series of videos.
Exactly the point. Just because he gets a bunch of things right doesn't mean that all the fantastical parts are true or historical.
The Pool of Bethesda having exactly 5 porticos.
This is something that I actually did not know about and was curious to see a bit more about, this Porticoes thing. And this is so stupid and insignificant that it actually amazes me that apologists consider this some epic win for the historicity of John. Apparently porticos, which are like a little, I guess kind of like arch alley type of thing, there is this Pool of Bethesda they reference, and here's a picture I saw. And look, this is what was thought to be the Pool of Bethesda. 5 porticos references here. Here's the Bible verse they're talking about. See how it says that, which has 5 porticos. A pool in Hebrew called Bethzatha, or in others Bethesda as it's named, which has 5 porticos. And if you look at this archaeological site, this is what's the Pool of Bethesda. This actually does not have 5 porticos. However, an archaeological dig in the 1880s, which Testify is referencing, shows that these basins north of the pool, when you count the 4 porticos along this basin, in addition to this bridge here, which has another portico, then that is 5 porticos. That is indeed a 5-sided pool. And up until this point, apparently, most biblical scholars didn't even think that there was a 5-sided pool. They thought that this was just referencing the 5, some other historical, mythological, theological number 5, right? Like 5 tribes or something, like 5 things of Israel or something like that. But okay, so maybe there's a specific pool, which is not the Pool of Bethesda, but a different one, but okay, whatever. And it has 5 porticos. Even if you give them that, what does that even mean? Why does that matter? It doesn't matter. It's the hopscotch story. Your kid has hopscotch, mythology, and just because that they got the snacks accurate and the playtime activity accurate doesn't mean that you're gonna believe that they just let his friend hopscotch for an hour nonstop, and that's exactly how long it went. And a 5-year-old could tolerate that. But let's move on.
Detail confirmed by archaeology centuries later.
Again, a detail confirmed by archaeology, but there was the wrong pool. And it's if you count the porticos in a specific way, but let's move on.
He knows about the Pool of Siloam and Solomon's portico. He knows the exact distance from Bethany to Jerusalem is about 15 stadia. He knows the exact theological friction between Samaritans and Jews over Mount Gerizim. He knows about the water pouring and lampstand rituals for the Feast of Booths. And he knows about the legal custom of taking care of the poor during Passover. Now,
okay, but just think about that last, the legal custom of taking care of the poor during Passover. This is actually really mundane, and any Jew from the 1st or 2nd century would have likely known this. You can imagine if you are somebody living today, and you can list off the facts like the current president of the United States of America. You can, give maybe a rough example of what capitalism is, which is the infrastructure around us. You can tell me about the current rate between the euro and the U.S. dollar and Japanese, and all these different facts you can tell me about the world. It doesn't mean that then you specifically can give a detailed account of some particular financial advisor, some Goldman Sachs executive. You can give his exact perfect biographical history. It just means that you are somebody more or less educated on the world around you today, who has some sort of knowledge about the world economics in a vague way. That doesn't mean that you are credible or even accurate in giving this exact particular biographical counting of some Goldman Sachs executive. And it doesn't lead you creating. The more you talk about, I know what the trend is with the semiconductor industry, and I know that the yen is actually recently going back over 160 USD per JPY, and I can tell you about this particular bank had this particular incident lately with its compliance and its money laundering. You can tell me all of those things, but that doesn't mean that you have suddenly now the credence to talk about this particular Goldman Sachs executive's history or their life, or that you even were there necessarily. In the same way, all of these facts about like what you do during Passover or a particular ritual, this is just what the average Jew of the time knew. This is just the average knowledge of them at the time today. Just like an average adult with a general sort of business or finance understanding of the world around us today would give all of that knowledge I just shared right now, would know all of those things I'm talking about right now. That doesn't mean they have the credence or the truth of the real story there. Again, take it back to the your 5-year-old kid. Just because they could tell you all of the snacks that they ate and the songs that they sang today doesn't mean that their fantastical story about their friend's hopscotch journey is true.
Why does this matter? Because John, he didn't have Google Maps. He didn't have ChatGPT, Wikipedia, digital archives, or searchable databases. In the ancient world, historical fiction wasn't a thing. Authors didn't.
Okay, do you notice the hodgepodge here of arguments? He's talking about how John, actually, and we don't even know that there was a John who wrote this. The writer of John didn't have access to all of these databases. Okay, I didn't have access to all of the world's databases right now, and I just spewed out a couple of facts about the world economy. You don't need to have a library and access to all of the different databases just to give the general understanding of the world around you at this time. If I could tell you 100 different facts about the town I live in and the culture of it, and I don't need to consort a database or Google Maps, right? So it has nothing to do with talking about this writer for John as if he's able to access all of a sudden grandiose amount of information. It is actually really mundane, all of the information that apparently are these historical feats that John is able to talk to. It just means that he has, or the writers of John have a generic understanding of the world around them as a Jew living in the time. Then he goes on to talk about the genre of fiction. So again, don't get caught off guard, the Gish Gallop, and let's just see the next argument.
Spend months doing library research to make their fantasy books look more authentic for entertainment. Research was brutal. Libraries were rare. Books were rare scrolls, copied by hand, with no indexes or footnotes. More importantly,
as I understand it, and again, I am not a biblical scholar, and I would argue Testify probably isn't either. They didn't do like this long pressed research to try and build like a fantasy world or anything like that, like you'd imagine, like J.R. Tolkien today, or Brandon Sanderson or something like that. Yeah, of course, sure, they don't do that. That's actually exactly why there are so many internal contradictions amongst the Gospels, amongst their own stories and anachronisms historically, because they are not researched longitudinally across everything in society and other, complementary writings at the time, because it's not researched. It exactly shows that it is, in fact, a human invention.
Who in the world is John trying to impress? He's writing to a broad audience across the Roman Empire decades after Jerusalem was leveled by the Romans. Most of his readers had never been to Judea. They couldn't fact-check the layout of Bethesda or the distance to Bethany. If John is just fabricating a theological myth, adding these hyper-specific, obscure local details, that's a bizarre, pointless strategy. But it gets...
Yeah, again, no one's claiming that because John includes the idea of like there being 5 porticos, it's John trying to make the book look more real than it is. No one's claiming that's what John's trying to do. What people are claiming is that apologists try to do that. Apologists today try to say, because John said these 5 porticos are here, because John could give the Judea distance accurately, that it's historically reliable. That's what people today are trying to do, and what skeptics today are pointing out. Nobody's saying that John tried to meticulously craft this. All people are saying is that apologists try to use those as arguments, so that's what's being broken down. Don't you just love the explicit gaslighting done by Testify here?
It's weirder. Skeptics also claim John is a master literary hoaxer because he creates obvious tensions with the 3 other Gospels, like where he places the cleansing of the temple or how he structures Jesus' speeches. So here is the dilemma we have to force the skeptic to answer. What kind of author...
It's not... Skeptics don't generally claim that he's like an excellent hoaxer. More so that it's just the development of the Christian mythology. But let's continue to see what he says.
Is clever enough to flawlessly research obscure pre-destruction Judean geography.
Again, research isn't necessary. He's just writing about the common knowledge of the time.
But careless enough to leave many apparent contradictions with the existing gospel traditions.
It's not careless in the sense that, he's just writing about it willy-nilly. It's careless in the sense that, he's just trying to develop on the tradition already established and evolve past that. It is as exactly, there is no contradiction. Nobody's trying to claim that John did all this in-depth research to try and write it. He just, again, wrote about what he knew at the time, and then the contradictions there exist explicitly because it wasn't, ultimately researched to the very ends of each spectrum. So yes, it's exactly in line perfectly with what a skeptic tries to argue.
It's almost universally accepted among scholars that John had access to Mark, and probably Luke, and possibly even Matthew.
Yeah, exactly. So they copied from one another. There's no arguing that.
If John is just a brilliant con artist, he would have at least smoothed out at least some of these wrinkles. If he's just making things up freely.
No one's trying to say that John's like a con artist. It's possible that John, believed truly, or whoever it was, what they were writing. There's nothing con artisty about that. It's just that it's a development. It's a theological development. And you can see it too there are, in fact, some elements you could see, like i.e. the guards being there or not being asleep, or the women coming to report about the empty tomb. That part seems to have been a development for the apologists of the time, i.e. wait, how would you know that the guards didn't stink them out or something like that, right? So there are parts there that you could actually see as developments, but otherwise it's again primarily just focused on developing the divinity of Jesus in John.
Really, he shouldn't be getting intricate historical texture of first century Judaism perfectly right.
I again, perfectly right. Just look at the John 5:2 thing here about the 5 porticos. It's from a specific counting of this archaeological dig in a specific way that you can get that accurate, and it just indicates that he was a Jew living in the 1st to 2nd century. It has nothing to do with it being him like going to all these specific different examples and trying to get everyone exactly perfectly right. That is a gross embellishment of what's actually in John.
That's why the Spider-Man objection misses the target completely.
The more I think about it, though, it doesn't really, because no one's saying that John is trying to put all this stuff into this to fabricate this excellent story of how Jesus is. John specifically went out of his way, you see, to add in all of these details to create the myth of Jesus. No, people are just saying apologists argue that John has all of these historical accuracies, therefore John is true, is a bogus argument. That has not changed at all through me watching this video. That's still perfectly in line. Yes, just because you say it has a historical accuracy, just because it has 100 historical accuracies, doesn't account for the supernatural, mythological purports of the writing. And it doesn't account for the other anachronisms existing within the writing. It's not skeptics having it both ways. It's perfectly coherent with how you understand logic historically. There can be 100 historical accuracies that you consider, as mundane truths, and the fictitious portions added in, you can take with, 50% doubt or 25% doubt, or basically understand it as purely mythology. That's why when you look at people like, for example, Dr. Richard Carrier, who I've been a big fan of lately, he talks about the existence of Jesus, even himself, as a likelihood. He is somebody who thinks that Jesus probably didn't even exist. But he doesn't say that definitively, I don't think Jesus existed. He says it in a probability. I think he says 2/3 likely that Jesus didn't exist, 1/3 possibility he did exist. Not even just like a historical Jesus, just a complete mythicist position. And he does that based off of the historical evidence, right? So you can get this probabilistic understanding, but just because you have all of these different historical elements lined up doesn't mean that the supernatural portions of that same story get any more credence or likelihood to probability, right? Just because your 5-year-old son tells you 20 things accurate about their day at daycare today doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to believe it's likely, right? You have a 20% likely. You maybe think it's only like 5% likely that their friend Jimmy actually did that for an entire hour. And if they tell you that they played and actually one of the toys came to life and started talking to him, right? No matter it could be 20, it could be 100, it could be 500 different things he tells you correct about that day. You're probably going to consider it 0% likely that a toy came to life and started talking to him. So that's how you can differentiate things from being mundane historical accuracies that any Jew from the time would have known and the supernatural claims. That's how you can differentiate them. And now it's not actually a contradiction at all for the skeptic to argue that point out correctly.
We aren't saying John mentions real places, therefore Jesus is God.
Yes,
we are saying that John displays a consistent pattern of casual, highly accurate, eyewitness level memory.
Again, highly accurate is subjective. Let's move on.
That he doesn't parade about. That pattern makes total sense if the author actually lived it, and it makes zero sense if this is just late-date theological fiction.
It could make sense that they lived a portion of it. Maybe he was a Jew living in the area at the time, and he could still write theological fiction. He could still write theological development. The fact that you can't say that, you can't rule that out, indicates that Testify's video is bad faith, and is just an example to try and get already believing Christians to condense and further bolster their own beliefs. If you look at the comments, for example, heads I win, tails you lose. If the details are wrong, it's false. It's still false. Reminds me of the invisible bulletproof shield out employee playing cops and robbers with friends when I was like 6. Again, these people, they are taking the argument and choosing to not understand it. It's not heads I win, tails I win. It's if you have a historical inconsistency, it shows that your work is inconsistent. If you have a historical accuracy, it shows that your work can have a historical accurate part in it, but that doesn't mean that you take the rest of the mythological parts of the supernatural parts and suddenly they're correct. And they say that it's the Spider-Man fallacy is moving of the goalposts, right? They say that you can make more and more arguments and that the goalpost just gets further and further. Again, but it's true that you can make as many arguments as you want for how the day at your daycare was, but you're not going to believe the talking toy story, would you? Or even the doing hopscotch for an hour straight story, would you? And then here's the other one. If 4 books were published by different people claiming to be faithful accounts of Spider-Man's life, and hundreds of people in New York City claim to have personally seen him, I wouldn't automatically believe it, but I would take it a lot more seriously than a comic book. He's saying that because there are 4 Gospels and hundreds of people saw Jesus, then he would think it's more accurate. Well, yeah, sure. That's actually another big part of why historists and all can verify or not verify things as being historical. It's because you can have independent sources verify or not one other. But the interesting is Testify even said this in his own video, that the Gospels copy from one another. So you can't even say that there are 4 different sources. It could literally just be one source copied over and embellished or changed around for different theological purposes over time. And the hundreds is claiming to is one of the epistles Paul writes references hundreds seeing Jesus. That's all there is, though. It's not that there are hundreds who actually saw it. It's just that Paul claims hundreds saw it, but we never get to see any of those hundreds of writings or hear about who they are. So all in all, it's all a bunch of bullcrap all the way down, but thanks for watching.